Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Sustainability and Your Investors. Our speakers today are Knut Hannes, a Senior Partner and Managing Director in BCG's Boston Consulting Group's Geneva office, and until recently, the global leader of BCG's Strategy Practice Area. And Gregory Unruh, the Ericsson Group Endowed Professor at George Mason University. I'm David Kiron, Executive Editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be both co-speaker and your moderator today. This event will be recorded and will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event. In addition, today's slides will be available to all attendees. We welcome your questions today. To submit questions, please enter them in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag MITSMR event. If you are having audio difficulties while listening via computer, please call in via telephone instead. Okay, so much for the housekeeping. This is what we have planned for you today. I'm going to give some background on MIT, SMR, and BCG's research collaboration. I'll then introduce this year's research project. Then Greg and Knut will discuss our key findings in much greater detail, and we will go into a Q&A session at the end. We're very excited to be here today to discuss the 7th Annual Sustainability Report, jointly produced by BCG and MIT SMR. The aim of doing these reports has been to better understand how sustainability issues are playing out in the corporate context. What are the key opportunities and challenges for companies with respect to sustainability? These are important questions since the private sector has a large role to play in addressing sustainability issues that world leaders, from the Pope to the U.S. President to the head of the United Nations, have identified as among the most urgent and important of our time. Over the years, we have explored the characteristics of companies that have embraced sustainability as part of their corporate strategy. We've examined the business case for sustainability, identified companies that are walking the talk on sustainability, and discussed corporate collaborations that solve business problems using sustainability-oriented approaches. We've surveyed tens of thousands of executives and managers in companies, large and small, from around the world in different industries. In addition to the surveys, each year we conduct interviews with academic experts and industry leaders to deepen our understanding of different sustainability trends that are taking place within the corporate landscape. In this year's research, we focus on investors. Part of the rationale for looking at investors is that corporate executives have a tendency to point to investors as a key stumbling block when it comes to their companies taking action on long-term sustainability issues. It is almost conventional wisdom that investors have a short-term focus and that corporate leaders tend to develop strategies to please their shareholders, or at least what they perceive would please their investors. So the accuracy of leadership's perceptions about shareholders matter a great deal. So we asked investors themselves what they think about the importance of sustainability performance to their investment decisions and analyzed whether their attitudes and behaviors matched up with executive attitudes about investors. On this slide, you can see that we had responses from 3,000 managers, many with senior roles in their organizations. Most of the respondents come from MIT SMR subscribers. More than 500 of the 3,000 respondents were investors. As the report discusses, many of these investors described their companies as being strategic, institutional, retail types of investors. The key question we looked at is, how is executive decision-making influenced by investor perceptions about sustainability? Do executives know what investors want? And the answer is, many executives do appreciate that investors have an interest in a company's performance on environmental, social, and governance metrics. But there's a sizable gap between the numbers of executives who believe that investors care about sustainability and the numbers of investors who say they care about sustainability. Investors care more about sustainability than many executives think. And the key survey finding that we have is that 3 out of 4 executives in investment firms agree that a company's good sustainability performance matters a great deal to them when making investment decisions. And Greg is going to explain a bit more about what that means in a moment. But just 3 out of 5 executives in publicly traded companies believe that good sustainability performance is materially important to investors. 3 out of 4 versus 3 out of 5. This is a substantial gap between what executives believe about investors and what investors themselves believe. This is why we say investors care more about sustainability than many executives think. In addition, bad sustainability performance matters a great deal to investment firms' top leadership. They will change their behavior based on what they see companies doing. So with that, we're going to move to Greg, who's going to dive more into the details of the research.
All right, thank you, David. So all of the sustainability professionals listening out there are familiar with this historic refrain you would get from your chief financial officer. Corporate financial managers would always say, when talking about sustainability, all of this stuff is great, all of the sustainability initiatives are fine, but investors don't care about it. Investors only care about next quarter's results. And that would stop the sustainability discussion in its tracks, because there really was no good response to this perception of short-term investor concerns. Sustainability, by definition, is concerned with the long term. And building sustainability value occurs by building an impact and a reputation over time. So that the perception that investors didn't care was a huge barrier to financing and moving forward on sustainability initiatives. And that's why the results of this year's survey are so important. Investors in our survey, as you heard, have reported that overwhelmingly they care about sustainability performance. Nearly 3/4 say sustainability is materially important to their investment decisions, which is big news. And and it's not some fringe attitude we found in these investment houses. It starts at the very top. Over 80% of directors and 3/4 of CEOs and C-suite executives say sustainability is something that needs to be accounted for in portfolio investment decisions. So this points to the high level of importance that sustainability issues are beginning to take in these institutions. And so the perception that investors don't care about sustainability is really out of date. And this is going to have implications for companies and corporate managers, and something they're going to need to begin to take account of as moving forward. And as David mentioned, the most immediate impact we're beginning to see already is that investors say they will divest or exclude companies with poor sustainability performance. Now, that's not just some kind of idle threat. We are actually beginning to see investors already doing this. And one of the sectors where this is happening the fastest and with the biggest impact is in the area of the fossil fuel sectors, both oil and gas and coal. There is a broad range of investors that are already in the process of divesting over $2 trillion in fossil fuel assets. That's trillion with a T, so that is clearly a material impact. And given the trends we've seen in international policy, especially the Paris climate agreements in December, the expectation is that investor pressure in these areas and on this sector will only rise. In fact, just yesterday, ExxonMobil had its annual general meeting, and the company faced 11 different shareholder resolutions that were calling on Exxon to account for the impact of climate change on its business. And this is an important one to watch because the company's board and executives have been resisting efforts to get the company to annually assess climate as a shareholder concern. And what's really important is that shareholders approved one of those resolutions yesterday, which has opened the way now for the possibility of having a climate expert on Exxon's board. So these are important trends, and you can see that investors can have a powerful influence on companies in terms of their attitudes towards sustainability and how they have to incorporate it into their strategic thinking. And the fossil fuel sector may just be the canary in the coal mine, and we may begin to see this trend expanding systematically to other industries and sectors. But it's not just negatively screening out or excluding poor sustainability performance in sectors. What I think is more interesting is we're beginning to see the use of sustainability performance data to proactively and positively select companies that are likely to grow and benefit from a more sustainable future that the world is moving into. And a recent high-profile example of this approach is generation investments. You know, Al Gore didn't invent the internet, but he and his partner David Blood appear to have invented a pretty reliable way to profit from sustainability. Their company, Generation Investments, was built on this assertion that incorporating ES&G indicators, environmental, social, and governance, or sustainability indicators, gives a bigger and better picture of a company's future financial prospects. And this year, Generation participated in a study that showed that their approach is, in fact, doing well by doing good. The data shows that out of the top 200 global equity management houses over a decade, Generation Investment ranked number 2, all right? And they have had very high returns. They've averaged more than 12% a year through this chaotic boom and bust global economic cycles we've been seeing, and they've consistently been beating market indices. Now, there have been impact investors and socially responsible investors active in the space for some time, but Generation's example has highlighted this mainstreaming of the understanding of the value of sustainability as an information source in making investment decisions. Generation credits their success to the broader investment perspective that ES&G data provides. And really the logic behind this is pretty simple. Better data means better informed decisions. And this is one of the things we're seeing with these investors. They have access now to more and better ES&G data, and they are now developing better algorithms, better models, and better methods to incorporate that data and evaluate their importance for their ongoing investment decisions. So we're seeing the shift towards a mature and a more sustainability-savvy investor base that understands how to use sustainability data. And what we're seeing is also a shift away from more older traditional approaches or ways we try to evaluate sustainability performance to more precise approaches. And it's leaving some of these older approaches in the dust. And one of these approaches are the sustainability indices, sustainability rankings, like Dow Jones Sustainability Index or the FTSE4Good. Our surveys indicated that investors don't find these indices or these rankings very helpful for investment decision-making. Only a third of the investors we surveyed said they actually consider them at all in their investment decision. And it's not limited just to the investment houses. We see similar skepticism in our survey among company managers. These are the company managers that have to collect the data and provide them so that they can actually be listed on these rankings. And the attitude we got both through the survey and the interviews is that companies are going through the motions. This is a pro forma thing that they're doing, but nobody seems to recognize very much value being created through that process. And, you know, some of the recent corporate sustainability disasters can indicate or help us understand why there might be skepticism towards ratings in some of these more traditional or earlier approaches. We've discovered this decade that managing sustainability can be incredibly costly for a company. Mismanaging the environmental issues around deep water oil production has cost BP, by some estimates, $54 billion. And we don't know. We still have to wait to see how much VW's mismanagement of its environmental emissions concerns is going to cost the company. However, what's important to notice is that prior to those disasters, both BP and VW were highly ranked in sustainability indices and ratings. Yet this ranking gave no information to investors, for example, about the risks that diesel engines could pose for VW's sustainability performance going forward. Now, we also, though, interviewed investors that said they use sustainability information proactively to evaluate the sustainability risks being faced by both BP and VW. And they used that insight then to get out of those stocks before the disasters and the massive hit to shares actually came. And you can read more about this in the report if that's interesting to you. But in terms of the indices and ratings, it was only after the disasters that these companies were actually then removed from the listings. So the indices seem to be a trailing, not a leading indicator of sustainability performance. And indices, you know, smart investors are looking elsewhere for their sustainability performance data. And this is going to be an important question going forward. Where is that information going to be coming from? Is it going to be coming from companies or is it going to be coming from somewhere else? And can companies successfully communicate the sustainability value their initiatives are creating? Can they create that in a compelling way to investors? And this was a large open question that came out of our research, and it may be one that Knut might touch on as he talks about some of the other interesting findings we discovered during this process.
Thanks, Greg. So you talked a little bit about the fact that investors actually care more than executives, broadly speaking, are aware of. And large part of why investors care is, of course, that there are risks involved, and you showed a couple of examples. The flip side of the coin on risk is revenue growth opportunities, and we see that too. I think it's fair to say that over the last couple of years, and we've been tracking this now for some time, we start seeing real revenue growth in the area of sustainability. So the mega trend is not only a trend in terms of addressing risks, it's also a trend in terms of seeing and driving the upside of sustainability. So on the slide, we point to some of what we call the green giants, so companies that actually have been able to generate substantial revenue with sustainability products or services. I'll talk about services afterwards, with high profitability. And you see a few examples there, but there are many. And I think main message is we will see more and more. And how do they do it? I mean, we will talk a little bit towards the end about kind of what are learnings for companies, etc. But I think there are 3 steps we just want to highlight here now. One is one which we've talked about over the years, which is the commitment from the top. The commitment from the CEO is, in all the cases we see, necessary. It's usually a top-down, bottom-up kind of process, but the top-down is critically important. And we're here saying the CEO, but I think in addition to the CEO, we should also say the board. Because in our 2014 study, David, we looked at the role of the board, and it's critical. What we actually found is boards care about sustainability, but they don't as often give good guidance to the executives when it comes to sustainability. So that's one. Second one is in many areas we will see opportunities through disruptions when it comes to sustainability. New technologies, new business models, new ways of doing things, local ways of building new value chains, etc. So what we see is that the companies that actually make this happen, they are not afraid of disruptive innovations. They actually embrace them as well, and they're willing to look for entirely new solutions. And then thirdly, really important, this does happen close with the key customers. So it can't only be a very niche kind of thing. It needs to be something that aims for mass markets. But we really see that also now in entirely new areas. I think food is one example where we see sort of a global explosion in the area of natural organics, etc. So as an example of mainstreaming and really building sustainability growth with the customers. So we're seeing the upside as well, and we see that investors care both about the risks, very important, but also on the upside. Let me share a couple of data points, over the time data points. And we've asked some questions, and we'll talk about a couple of them over the years. So 6 time data points on the question of, is a sustainability strategy necessary to be competitive? And what I'd say about that is a majority says yes. A sustainability strategy is necessary, and this is relatively stable, around 60%. I think there has been some ups and downs, but it's very much around 60%. And another sort of 20% plus saying, if it isn't necessary to be competitive today, it will be tomorrow. So there's a broad understanding, and it's robust, it's stable, we see it over time, on the question of the necessity of really addressing sustainability. That being said, I think a lot of companies are confused and feel a little bit humbled by how to address it, because it can be somewhat daunting and often a little bit too complex. And that really plays to the next slide, which I think is a little bit the essence of the sustainability challenge. There is actually a discrepancy between intentions and reality. 90% of all companies, just about, consider a sustainability strategy as important. 90%, so most companies. 60% say that they incorporate sustainability into their strategy, so into their prioritizations, resource allocation, overtime planning, etc. But only a quarter say that they have a business case for sustainability. And on this point, I think what we see is that companies over time probably become more capable of building the business case, but they also become more humble in terms of saying that they do. And this, I think, is a little bit the essence of sustainability. We want to drive sustainability challenges. We see the importance of it, but many companies still struggle with how to make it tangible, how to really show the value proofs, how to really document the value creation, etc. But we're seeing great examples. We're seeing great success stories, and we're also starting to see pretty good documentation that companies that really drive sustainability strategies are actually, on the whole, more successful financially as well. I think this is an area that is opening up. We're starting to see. We will see it more clearly over time, but I think the window is now open. Let's move a little bit ahead and look at another over-the-time point that we've mentioned and that I want to talk a little bit about. This is the value proposition. And I think, in a way, we have a huge job to do here to clarify the value proposition of sustainability. When we listen to investors, and of course that's what we've done this year around, investors are very clear on one thing. There is risk associated with poor sustainability strategies. We want to stay away from that risk. We're even willing to exit. So that's one very tangible area of value propositions. The other area is, of course, the area of competitive advantage, growth into new areas, etc. And here we see a lot of companies struggling. But we see it as critically important, and we see good examples. But I would say that, as I mentioned, backtracking 5-6 years, more companies said that they had the business case nailed down than today. I think it's a reflection of a little bit the modesty of actually trying to make it happen. A quarter does, and I think that quarter is probably one that's been building experience over the last 5-10 years. Okay, business models. And we did have a report out on that 4 years ago on the link between sustainability and business model changes. It's really interesting, and one of the most important areas of the future sustainability economy. And I'd say two things. We see huge changes in business models, particularly as companies drive sustainability aggressively. We see things like from selling energy to selling energy efficiency, so taking on a much more managed service solution. And we see lots of great examples related to putting on the lens of the circular economy, where you take a more holistic perspective, you look at recycling opportunities, you look at opportunities of collaborating much more closely in the value chain or in the system that you work within. So I think this whole issue of sustainability and business model change is one which is, again, very important and one to watch out for. I think ambitious sustainability strategies will require, in many cases, that we are actually open to changing and adapting our business models. Next page, just an example. I think we could mention lots of examples, and we could mention other examples, of course. But I think this is a nice one where we just see tangible evidence that investors, in so many cases, are willing to pay a premium. So it's not only about kind of, staying away from the risks, but it's also investing into good practices. And the example here is, big multinational, Japan-based multinational acquiring a commodity trader, and openly in the media saying that we're paying a premium, and the premium is really related to the security of palm oil sourcing, organic palm oil sourcing, which is important, and it's an area where you actually can build a real competitive edge that others can't really replicate fast, which is also, of course, the reason for a premium. So I think there is more and more stories to illustrate the investor perspective. Let me talk a little bit about the communication around sustainability, and one thing we see, and I think we've seen that over time as well, but this year more closely, is that sustainability ambitions don't necessarily translate down to the whole organization. We do see that it actually trickles down more effectively in investment firms than in large corporations. In part, that's because these are tighter ships and often smaller ships as well. But I think in part it's also because there's maybe a more shared understanding of which few things are we really looking at when it comes to sustainability. What do we want to avoid? And I would say also as a kind of a management consulting working across industries, the whole art of due diligence in many cases has changed from not really looking for sustainability risks in the past to today being much more aware of risks related to labor practices, to environmental footprint, to license to operate kind of challenges, etc. So I think on the investor side there is a trickle down, and it's stronger than everything else equal in large corporations, where this is a big challenge. There is a challenge of actually embedding sustainability ambitions into strategies and making them come alive in the whole organization. There's no hiding. This is really a case. And on the right-hand side of this slide, just quick observation around investor relations professionals. They don't talk much about sustainability. They are not asked to talk about it. It's not something that comes up. But I do think that this year's study probably sends a signal that this is something that should be addressed simply because investors actually care about it. They will care less about the kind of fluffy ambition statements, but they will care very much about the risks and the growth opportunities having been achieved and the opportunities for profitable growth going forward. So that's a little bit over time picture as well. There is of course more, but I think I feel that there are two things we kind of see in the over time picture. We see that the commitment is robust. We see patterns that are clear, and then I think we see more clarity among a certain amount of companies that actually build real business cases, build competitive advantages, and that build growth opportunities in the area of sustainability. And if I move that to the next slide, just a couple of observations around, what does this year's study mean for companies? And the first observation would be to say that executives, CEOs should not underestimate the importance of sustainability to investors. It is actually important, and investors are more aware, and they care more about the underlying risks because they see them, they're transparent. There are big cases out there that actually, as we've shown a couple of examples of, have huge consequences. So let's not underestimate the importance. That's one. Second one is a little bit more on kind of building the sustainability strategy. And before I go into the points, I just want to make one observation which I think is important for all companies. I think it's really important to distinguish compliance. What do we do to comply? and competitive advantage. In which few areas do we want to build a competitive advantage? Compliance and competitive advantage are not the same, and they shouldn't be addressed in the same way. And in many cases, we see that they're I would say, mixed up a bit, and clarity on compliance and competitive advantage is certainly important. So a couple of steps that we feel are important, also based on this year's and prior studies. So building awareness, which is really what we are trying to do with this data and with the Overtime series as well. Secondly, be very clear on what the material issues are. Companies that are actually able to define and address and drive towards material issues do better, and it's very well documented in research and in case examples, etc. Drive to material issues and be very precise on which issues really matter for us, our survival as a company. And then thirdly, be very focused on the tangible, measurable outcomes, and that brings us back to the business case. This takes off when we can document and be very specific around it. When it's fuzzy and more as a declaration, it doesn't really mobilize employees, but it doesn't really mobilize investors either. Translate this into a sustainability strategy. Be open to the fact that there needs to be a value proof, and we've talked about that. And last point, engage investors. Engage investors in the sustainability strategy discussions. I think they're open to it, but that kind of requires the points above, that we're actually able to talk about the material issues, that we're able to talk about the business case, that we're able to talk about measurable outcomes, and that there's, a link between sustainability, compliance, and competitive advantage. And I think that really needs to be very clear. So that's a bit the recommendations for companies. And David, you will take us a little bit into the investor perspective as well before we open up.
Thank you, Knut. That's exactly right. Thank you, Greg and Knut, for your discussion of the key findings from the report, in addition to the discussion about our recommendations for companies. The final slide in the presentation, before moving on to the Q&A part, is recommendations for the investors. So, next slide. So we have a few recommendations for investors, and they all center around a few key points. This first bullet, clearly short-term investment strategies can have a place in an investment portfolio, but there are clear signs that mid to long-term investment strategies that factor in corporate performance on sustainability issues can carry less risk in some instances, and can outperform mainstream indices. But in order to identify, what can be solid mid to long-term investment strategies, you need to recognize that there's a suite of tools that now exist and that are actually building, that recognize how non-financial information can be material to a company's prospects. There's a growing number of resources, both in terms of tools, people, organizations, that can identify what that information is and talk about how to use it. Those are the next two, the second and third bullets. You don't have to develop your own valuation methods to account for non-financial sustainability issues, but these things exist outside, and what we're finding is that in lieu of there being a great many of these resources, some companies, some investment firms are developing their own. The next slide, the next bullet: avoid relying on sustainability indices, which can be misleading. Who doesn't like the comfort of investing in a top-ranked company? but not all rankings are considered are equal. With many rankings based on subjective information self-reported by the companies, these may not be a reliable source of investment information. Don't be misled by the bright stars at the top of rankings. VW that Greg mentioned is a prime example. In the last bullet, actively engage in discussions on sustainability topics with companies, which is the inverse of the last point that Knut has made. Engage, where he was talking about executives engaging investors. Here we're talking about investors engaging with companies in different ways. If companies don't know that you as an investor care, they'll assume you don't. That's been the status quo for some time. We did a survey with the National Institute of Investor Relations Professionals that looked at what investor relations professionals were seeing in the marketplace in terms of the dialogue between what their companies were representing about sustainability and what people in the market, in the investor marketplace, were looking for in terms of information about their company's sustainability performance. And they saw a big disconnect. And what we heard from the investor relations professionals is that they're waiting for questions, and they're perfectly happy to ignore folks who are not asking questions about sustainability, because in large part their companies don't have a story to tell about sustainability. So that concludes the session on the presentation. We're going to move into the Q&A session. We've gotten lots of great questions, and we'll continue to take your questions for the remainder of the hour. A reminder that you can submit your questions by entering them into the chat box in the lower left corner of the webinar screen, or on Twitter using the hashtag MITSMR event. And we've got, since I was just speaking to that slide, we've just had a tremendous number of questions come through. I'm going to start us off with one question to Greg, who we have not heard from in a little while I sort through some of these questions. Greg, one of these questions was asking about wage inequality within a company. Do investors recognize this as a sustainability issue? How would you answer that?
Right. Well, first of all, I would say that was not something we explicitly sought to learn from our survey here, and it's not something that came up in the specific interviews we did for this report. That said, there are a broad number of issues that fall under this growing umbrella of what includes sustainability, and governance. Clearly governance, both internal governance within the organization and the relationship to a company to, say, political governance. These are all sort of emerging sustainability issues. They're not necessarily fringe, but they're not universally recognized by all companies and most stakeholders as sustainability concerns. Salary or income inequality within the organization is important to some stakeholder groups, and they are beginning to be effective at bringing attention to that problem, both to the public and to company executives. A lot of the attention is on executive pay, as we've seen, and that is a concern that's being brought by investors to the board and to annual meetings through resolutions and proxy initiatives. So that is a concern. It's not one that we can specifically address from our current survey, but it is one of these issues that has fallen under the umbrella of sustainability, and increasingly companies need systems to identify and be aware of these what seem like peripheral issues and be able to quickly evaluate, is that an issue that's going to impact us, is that an issue? Is that an area where our organization face potential risks if we get stakeholder attention to the way we're managing it? And also, is there an opportunity for us to in a differentiated way take action on this issue such that it helps maybe drive some kind of resolution to the problem, but also then enhances or improves our business value creation as well. So that's the way I would look at that. I would look at these more broadly, that there will be lots of issues, sector by sector, industry by industry, that emerge that sort of fringe stakeholders are paying attention to, and what we see and what we think is necessary is that companies develop systems to quickly evaluate and determine how material those issues are going to be for our organization, and how much managerial attention should we pay to them, and does it require then the innovation or business model change that Knut was discussing earlier.
That's great. And Knut, do you another question that seems right up your alley involves C-suites and boards. Do you see C-suites, members of the C-suite, CEOs, with a desire to bring boards into the sustainability conversation?
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, we did this report 2 years ago with the UN Global Compact. We looked at the role of boards. I think almost 90% of executives surveyed argued that board commitment is important to drive successful sustainability strategies. So almost 90%. But only 45% just about said that the board guidance and support is satisfactory. So there's a huge gap between the need for board support and the guidance and the support actually being given by board. So I think this is a big area. Executives need it, and they need it not only in terms of the commitment to sustainability in broad terms. They also need it for very specific purposes. One such specific purpose is the whole area of collaboration. Increasingly, winning in sustainability is a team sport. You can't, as a company, do it alone. You need to partner up. Partnering up is difficult for many reasons. You need the experience, you need the access, you need the ability to prioritize, etc. And in this area, I would say that boards can be and can play a very important role. So I'm a big one when it comes to the role of boards, and there's much more that can be done. And we uncovered that a couple of years ago. I think there's a lot that can be done and should be done. And I think now we open a new door. That's the investor side. And I think opening these kind of doors is important because it builds better overall understanding of how to be successful in a very difficult, very broad, and very complicated area.
Greg, do you see the low? How would you interpret the low numbers that Knut just mentioned regarding board engagement, the 45% number? Would you say that has more to do with attitudes or skills? A lack of attitudes, a lack of interest, or a lack of skills, or something else? Partially both.
I mean, we are. If you look at board members, we're facing a generational change. I don't have the exact data, but a lot of board members are older. They develop their business know-how and their business success in a time before sustainability was as recognized and important as it is now. So there is a knowledge gap and an understanding gap, and there has been efforts to create and provide educational opportunities, training programs for board members to help them better understand and manage the implications of social and environmental trends on the companies that they're advising or that they're sitting on the board for. So there's a sort of attitudinal problem, or I shouldn't say problem, but an issue that many of these you have to be a pretty senior person usually to get on the board, and that means you grew up in your company before sustainability was a major issue. And then, my impression in working on the board issue is most people on boards are not that open to developing new knowledge and new skills. They've been very successful, and they feel that they're in that position because they know as much or more than anyone else. And so there's a little bit of a resistance as well to dip into the world of sustainability that seems awfully foreign and often peripheral to what you've seen as important in business. So I think the numbers reflect something about the population of most established board members today or over the last 10 years or so. And I get a sense, we haven't done the research, but I get a sense we are shifting. There is a generational shift that will be occurring in boards going forward, that we will begin to populate boards with people that are more knowledgeable and perhaps sensitive to these concerns than have been previously.
And I would just add one thing, Greg. I agree to what you're saying, but there's nothing that actually drives a proactive stance on sustainability more than a crisis. And many of the companies that today have the best practices have been through a crisis, whether it's the Nikes, the Apples, the H&Ms. There are lots of examples. I've seen lots of them personally as well. And a crisis actually is an ad hoc thing. It needs to be dealt with. It's often dealt with well, and it often builds an appetite to be long-term and proactive and deal with this strategically as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, here's another question. At what point can divestment be impactful when there are always investors who will purchase dumped shares? Any sell-off has only a temporary impact. Knut or Greg?
Why don't you start it, Greg, and maybe I can add to it.
So, that is true. Now, the question is how big of a population shift are we seeing in terms of investors? And it's true. There will always be traders, short-term traders, that take advantage of these types of moves. And the question is, are these sectoral shifts in investor interest going to have an implication? We're not at a point where there are established sort of investment products, large investment products that say a pension fund or a mutual fund. They're not that. We don't have those scale products yet that incorporate sustainability information, sustainability ESG data into the stock process. As that occurs, though, you will see. I think you'll be able to see, and as that approach begins to prove itself increasingly over time. I mean, we have now over a decade's worth of data, including what we talked about, the generation investment case example, but there's plenty of academic research over the years that has showed incorporating sustainability considerations into your portfolio selection doesn't reduce your returns. At the very least, it's neutral. And then a big majority of the studies show that incorporating sustainability in your investment strategy actually enhances returns. And if that's the case, then you'll see more and more investors shifting towards that. That'll also have the knock-on effect of influencing more companies to include sustainability into their strategy and into their business model shifts. And so, I think what we'll see is there will still be investors that are not concerned about sustainability, but as incorporating the S&G proves itself, you'll see more and more investors shift towards that, and you'll see you can imagine. Just imagine the impact. So Walmart, when it decided that it was going to evaluate companies the sustainability performance of their products as a criteria for deciding whether or not they go on their shelves, just imagine a Fidelity or a Vanguard beginning to do the same thing with providing investment options to retail investors. And if that becomes the case, then the gatekeeper about whether or not your stock is included in this mutual fund or in this portfolio or in this pension fund is not going to be decided by the sort of short-term traders, but these massive institutional investment houses. So I think we're at the beginning of a long-term sectoral shift, and how exactly it plays out, it can't clearly be mapped out right now, but what's very clear is everybody on this phone conversation is going to be involved in playing a role and experiencing the implications and consequences of that shift.
Knut, do you have anything to add to that, or should we move on to the next question? I think we can move on. I think it's a very good answer.
Okay. Well, that's absolutely true. In environments where investors' knowledge about sustainability is still developing or limited, how do you impress upon CEOs to embrace sustainability principles?
I think that's a good one for Knut.
Okay, I'll get it, and then I think. Listen, I mean, expertise. You don't need to have all the expertise in house, right? You just need to be aware that there are consequences of their risks, their upsides, etc. There is increasingly expertise out there, right? We can hire in, analysts, expertise, etc., to help us on sustainability issues. And of course, the thing about sustainability, it's very broad, right? So it's difficult to have expertise in all the areas under one roof or in one person. There are labor issues, corruption issues, there are all kinds of environmental issues, etc. So climate change related, etc. So I think you don't need to be an expert. It's like most areas. You have to be aware of the consequence and then pull in expertise. I would say, though, that we see more as we see this becoming more important, and as we see the consequences being real, we also see that investors are building in this expertise in the way they deal with cases. Whether it's kind of a portfolio investing or whether it's, and we see that, for example, in private equity, whether it's case by case, where it's, of course, more inbuilt into due diligence processes, etc. But I think the expertise is gradually being mobilized and being built.
Okay, thanks, Knut. Okay, we have another question about business case. You state that only about 25% of all companies have created a business case or value proof for sustainability. What is it that those folks are doing that's better than others?
Well, I think there's no rocket science to this, I think. But as mentioned a couple of times, we're talking about a very broad area, right? So it's difficult to kind of nail it down. And the companies that at least I've seen and we've seen together getting the business case right are companies that are very clear in terms of being, what are the material issues? We can't deal with 100 issues. What are the ones that really matter for us and where there are risks or where there are opportunities? So material issues, that's one. Secondly, what is the necessary compliance and how do we address that in a kind of straightforward way, the way we would deal with compliance in other areas that can be health and safety, etc. And in which few areas do we want to build competitive advantage, where we think that there are, underlying opportunities, trends, etc., that makes, and where we have capabilities, or at least a willingness to build capabilities that give us that kind of edge over time. So the more specific you are, And the more you're able to zoom it in on a few real issues, the easier it is to build the business case. And I think, and we see so many successful companies now, they're all able to do those three things, define materiality, define what's compliant, agree on where we want to build over time a competitive advantage, grow in new areas, etc. That would be the advice I have, and I think it's relatively, once you get started going down that route, it becomes relatively straightforward, because it becomes more like all the other business cases we do and develop in our strategies and in our business prioritization and planning.
Okay.
Yeah, David, I would add to that in that what Knut said is exactly right, and the following step is the moving towards innovation, and even if it's disruptive innovation for your existing successful business model. We didn't necessarily mention this, but we found that companies that reported actually making changes to their business model were more than 2 times more likely to report that they were generating business value from the sustainability initiatives than others. So that's key to it, is actually committing to a sustainability strategy and then innovating sustainability solutions, products or services that meet your customers' need, but do so in a way that address sustainability challenges. And that additional step of actually then taking action on sustainability and building it into your future competitive advantages is really important to actually succeeding on this.
Yeah. So there have been a couple of questions about access to the content that we've been talking about. I just wanted to point out that I hope everybody can see this, is that there's a link to the report that's sloanreview.mit.edu/sustainability2016, where you can access the actual report. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, and some people may have missed this, we are going to be making available the deck to all participants later. So we have just a couple minutes left before the end of the presentation. One of the last, there have been a number of questions about how to get CEOs more active around sustainability, and there's been the question about how do you do that in an environment in countries where there might ostensibly be other priorities. There's a question about sort of how do you do it from within the organization, how do you do it from an investor perspective. Knut, Craig, do you have a 30-second point to make about how do you get the attention? And it does, of course, depend on who you are and where you're communicating from. But how do you get the senior leadership more engaged around sustainability when it's perceived to be a marginal kind of issue for the organization?
Well, this is Greg. I'll just take a quick shot. I mean, it's not an easy, simple answer, but there's a couple things. One thing Knut pointed out is a crisis, and usually the crisis, a sustainability crisis in a big consumer-facing brand is what gets things started. What happens then afterwards is all of the suppliers to those big consumer-facing brands, sustainability moves up very quickly on their agenda and gets on the agenda of the CEO as well. So there's something about cascading sustainability demands throughout a value chain or throughout a supply chain that can be pretty powerful and drive a lot of this. So So I would say just that perspective. And we also see that there's something about competition as well. We've seen industry by industry when one major player stands up and decides they're going to differentiate themselves and compete on sustainability, it puts competitive pressure on all the other companies in the industry to come up with a response. And so you have this sort of domino effect. And you can see this happening as well. And it turns out, CEOs and chief executives are quite competitive people, and they're more than willing. If someone throws down the gauntlet on sustainability, I've seen that motivate a number of executives in many parts of the world. I've seen that happen in Europe. I've seen that happen here in the United States. I've seen it happen in Latin America and Asia. So those are two things. One is if your major customer is
Greg,
yes.
We're gonna have to cut you off so we can get Knut in for last few seconds before we close the session. Or Knut, do you have anything to add on this question?
I agree with Joe. I agree with Greg. And the only thing I would add is the more this becomes tangible, the more we will see companies driving towards value creation, and that's what we really want. We don't want this to be finger pointing or a moral imperative. We want it to be a competitive imperative. I think that's what drives innovation and value and competitive advantage.
Perfect.
Here.
That concludes this portion of our program. A reminder that a recording of this program and the presentation slides will be available within 3 to 4 business days. Thank you for attending our program today.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.